The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the weathered general store, and Priscilla Montgomery pressed her gloved hand against her stomach to calm the churning dread that had plagued her for the last 300 miles. Through the dusty window, she could see the small town of Bandera, Texas, stretching out before her like a collection of sun-bleached bones scattered across the prairie. And somewhere in this desolate place was the man who had purchased her future with nothing more than a few letters and a train ticket. It was June of 1879, and Priscilla had left behind everything she knew in Charleston, South Carolina. Her father had died 6 months prior, leaving debts that consumed their modest home and every possession within it. Her mother had passed when Priscilla was only 14, which meant at 22 years old, she found herself utterly alone in the world with no family, no prospects, and no choice but to answer one of the advertisements in the matrimonial papers. Thomas Irving had written to her 3 times, his penmanship neat and economical, his words equally sparse. He needed a wife. She needed security. It seemed a transaction as old as time itself. The driver opened the door, and Texas heat rolled into the coach like an invisible wave. Priscilla gathered her worn carpetbag and stepped down onto the dusty street, her black traveling dress already feeling suffocating in the late afternoon sun. She had worn black for her father, though the mourning period had officially ended. Somehow, wearing colors had seemed presumptuous for a mail-order bride traveling to meet a stranger who might treat her as nothing more than an unpaid servant. She had heard the stories. Women arriving to find their husbands were drunkards, or violent men, or liars who had misrepresented everything from their age to their circumstances. One woman in Charleston had returned after only 2 months, her arm in a sling and her spirit broken, warning anyone who would listen about the dangers of marrying strangers. Priscilla had listened to that warning and answered Thomas Irving's advertisement anyway, because a dangerous possibility seemed better than a certain future of destitution. "Miss Montgomery." The voice came from her left, deep and hesitant, and Priscilla turned to face her fate. The man standing there was tall, easily over 6 feet, with broad shoulders stretching the fabric of a clean blue shirt. His face was tanned from years under the merciless Texas sun, with strong features that might have been carved from the same limestone that dotted the surrounding hills. Dark hair curled slightly at his collar beneath a well-worn hat, and his eyes were an unexpected shade of green that reminded her of the ocean she would likely never see again. But it was what he held in his hands that made Priscilla freeze in place, her rehearsed greeting dying on her lips. Wildflowers. A bouquet of purple blooms mixed with delicate white blossoms and bright yellow centers, tied together with what looked like a strip of leather. The flowers were slightly wilted from the heat, but they had clearly been picked with care, arranged with an attention that spoke of genuine effort. "I'm Thomas Irving," he said, and then he smiled. It was not a predatory smile or a cruel smile or even an indifferent smile. It was nervous and hopeful and entirely unexpected. "These are for you. They're wild verbena and some Blackfoot daisies. I know they're not roses or anything fancy like you probably had back east, but they grow all over my property, and I thought you might like to know what to expect out here." Priscilla stared at him, then at the flowers, then back at his face. In all her imaginings during the long journey west, she had never once pictured this. She had prepared herself for disappointment, for possible cruelty, for indifference at best. She had not prepared herself for kindness. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. She reached out and took the bouquet, her fingers brushing against his calloused ones for just a moment. The flowers smelled like the wild prairie, like sunshine and freedom and things that grew without permission. "They're beautiful." His smile widened, relief washing over his features. "I was worried you wouldn't come. When the stage was late, I thought maybe you changed your mind in Fort Worth and decided to head back home." "The stage had trouble with a wheel outside of San Antonio," Priscilla said, still trying to reconcile this gentle giant with the terse letters she had received. "We lost half a day while the driver made repairs. Well, I'm grateful you made it safely." Thomas glanced at her single carpet bag. "Is this all your luggage?" Priscilla felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment. "Yes, I didn't have much to bring." Something flickered in his eyes, not judgment, but understanding, maybe even sympathy. "Then we travel light. My wagon is just over here. It's about an hour's ride to the ranch, and I imagine you'd like to see your new home before the sun sets." He picked up her bag as though it weighed nothing and gestured toward a sturdy wagon hitched to two well-groomed horses. Priscilla followed, hyper-aware of the curious stares from townspeople going about their business. No doubt they all knew exactly who she was and why she had come. In a town the size of Bandera, a mail-order bride would be the most interesting gossip for weeks. Thomas helped her up onto the wagon seat with a steadying hand, his touch gentle and respectful. He climbed up beside her and took the reins, clicking his tongue to urge the horses forward. As they rolled out of town, Priscilla clutched her bouquet and tried to organize the chaos of her thoughts. "I should tell you about the ranch," Thomas said, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. "It's not large, but it's mind-free and clear. 200 acres with good grazing and a creek that runs year-round. I have about 50 head of cattle right now, a few horses, some chickens. The house is small but solid. I built it myself 4 years ago when I first claimed the land." "You built it yourself?" Priscilla asked, surprised. "Yes, madam. My father was a carpenter back in Missouri before he passed. He taught me how to work with wood, how to make things square and true." Thomas kept his eyes on the road ahead, but she could hear the pride in his voice. "I know it's not a fancy plantation house or anything like what you're probably used to, but it doesn't leak, and it stays cool in summer, warm in winter." Priscilla almost laughed at his assumption about her background. "Mr. Irving, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I didn't come from wealth. My father was a bookkeeper. We had a modest home, nothing grand. When he died, the debts took everything." Thomas glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "You don't have to call me Mr. Irving. We're to be married. Thomas is fine, or Tom if you prefer. Then you should call me Priscilla." "Priscilla," he repeated, as if testing how her name felt in his mouth. "It's a pretty name, suits you." They rode in silence for a while, the wagon wheels creaking rhythmically as they followed a well-worn trail through the scrubland. The landscape was nothing like South Carolina. Instead of humidity and pine trees and cultivated fields, Texas spread out in all directions with wild grasses, twisted live oaks, and rocky hills that rose in the distance like ancient sentinels. It was harsh and unforgiving, but there was a stark beauty to it that Priscilla had not expected. "Can I ask you something?" Thomas said finally. "Of course. What made you answer my advertisement? I know there are men closer to Charleston who need wives. Why come all the way out here?" Priscilla considered her answer carefully. She could lie, could pretend that she had been drawn to his letters or had always dreamed of adventure in Texas. But there had already been too much pretense in her life, too many smiles hiding desperation. If she was going to build a life with this man, perhaps honesty was the best foundation. "Because your letters were honest," she said. "You didn't make grand promises. You didn't claim to be wealthy or particularly exciting. You simply said you had a ranch, that you worked hard, and that you needed a wife to help build a life with." After reading dozens of advertisements full of exaggeration and obvious lies, your honesty stood out. Thomas was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. I'm glad my terrible writing skills worked in my favor then. I've never been good with fancy words. Fancy words are easy, Priscilla said, surprising herself with her own boldness. Truth is harder. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw something kindle in his green eyes, respect, maybe, or the first spark of genuine connection. I think we're going to get along just fine, Priscilla. The ranch came into view as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The house was indeed small, a single-story structure made of limestone and wood with a covered porch spanning the front. It sat in a natural clearing with the creek Thomas had mentioned visible to the south, marked by a line of larger trees. A barn stood nearby, along with a chicken coop and several corrals. Everything looked well-maintained, cared for with obvious attention. "It's lovely," Priscilla said, and meant it. There was something honest about the place, something solid and real that appealed to her in ways she had not anticipated. Thomas pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and jumped down, coming around to help her descend. His hands spanned her waist as he lifted her down, and for a moment they stood close together, near enough that she could smell soap and leather and sunshine on his skin. "I should show you inside," he said, stepping back quickly, as if suddenly aware of the intimacy of their position. "I tried to make everything ready for you." He was not exaggerating. The interior of the house was spotlessly clean, from the worn but scrubbed wooden floors to the simple furniture that filled the main room. There was a stone fireplace on one wall, a table with 4 chairs, a rocking chair positioned near the window. Everything was spare but functional, and Priscilla could see evidence of recent effort everywhere: fresh wildflowers in a jar on the table, curtains that looked newly washed, floors that still smelled faintly of lye soap. "The bedroom is through there," Thomas said, gesturing to a doorway on the right. "I've been sleeping out in the barn the last few nights to give you privacy until we're properly married. I thought we could go see Reverend Matthews tomorrow if that suits you. He's the minister here in Bandera. Good man, performs most of the marriages in the area." Priscilla felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. He was giving her space, time, treating her with a respect that seemed almost old-fashioned given that she had traveled across the country specifically to marry him. "That would be fine. Thank you for being so considerate." Thomas shrugged, looking uncomfortable with the praise. "It just seems right. I know this whole situation is strange. You've agreed to marry a man you've never met, travel hundreds of miles from everything you know. The least I can do is try to make you comfortable. Can I ask you something now?" Priscilla said. "Sure." "Why did you advertise for a wife? You seem like a decent man with a good property. Surely there are women in Bandera who would have been interested." Thomas walked to the window and stood looking out at his land, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the fading light. "There are a few unmarried women in town, that's true, but Bandera is small and everyone knows everyone else's business. The available women here are either too young or not interested in ranch life. I thought about courting a widow in town, Mrs. Carson, but she made it clear she has no interest in marrying again. She's happy running her dress shop and being independent." He turned back to face Priscilla. "The truth is, I'm tired of being alone. I've worked hard to build this place and it's good land, but it feels empty with just me here. I want a partner, someone to share the work and the rewards. I want children someday, a family. I'm 30 years old, and if I'm going to build that life, I need to start now." There was no manipulation in his words, no attempt to appeal to her sympathy. He was simply stating facts as he saw them, laying out his motivations with the same straightforward honesty that had drawn her to his letters in the first place. "I'm 22, Priscilla said, "and I want those things too. A home, a family, a purpose. I don't expect romance or grand passion. I just want a life built on mutual respect and honest work." Thomas nodded slowly. "Then we want the same things. That seems like a good place to start." That night, after a simple meal of beans and cornbread that Thomas prepared himself with surprising competence, Priscilla lay in the comfortable bed in the small bedroom and tried to process everything that had happened. She had arrived in Bandera expecting, at best, polite indifference. At worst, she had steeled herself for potential cruelty or disappointment. Instead, she had found a man who greeted her with flowers and kindness, who spoke to her with respect, who seemed genuinely invested in building something good together. The wildflowers he had given her sat in the jar on the small table beside the bed, their sweet scent filling the room. Priscilla reached out and touched one of the purple petals, marveling at how something so small could represent so much. Hope, she realized. That was what she was feeling for the first time in months. Fragile, tentative hope that maybe her future would not be as bleak as she had feared. The next morning, Thomas knocked on the bedroom door shortly after dawn and called through the wood. "I've made coffee and breakfast if you're hungry." "No rush, though. You must still be tired from your journey." Priscilla dressed quickly in her only other good dress, a simple gray cotton that had seen better days. When she emerged, she found Thomas setting plates on the table, his hair still damp from washing. He had changed into a clean white shirt and dark trousers, clearly his best clothes. "I thought we could head into town mid-morning," he said, pouring coffee into a tin cup for her. "That'll give us time to see Reverend Matthews and have the ceremony if you're still agreeable." I asked Mrs. Henderson. She runs the boarding house, if she and her husband would stand as witnesses. They're good people. "That sounds fine," Priscilla said, accepting the coffee gratefully. She took a sip and was pleasantly surprised. It was good coffee, strong and hot, nothing like the weak, bitter brew she had endured on the stagecoach. They ate breakfast together, eggs from his chickens and thick slices of bread with butter, and Priscilla found herself studying Thomas in the morning light. He had strong hands scarred from hard work, and he ate with focused efficiency, like a man accustomed to fueling himself for a long day of labor. But there was also a gentleness in the way he moved, a carefulness that spoke of controlled strength. "Can you tell me about your family?" she asked. "Your letters mentioned that your parents had passed, but not much else." Thomas set down his fork. "My mother died when I was 15. Fever took her during a hard winter in Missouri. My father never really recovered from losing her. He taught me his trade, made sure I could take care of myself, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. He passed 5 years ago, and I decided to come to Texas to make a fresh start. My sister, Mary, married a man in Kansas. I haven't seen her in 3 years, but we exchange letters a few times a year. She has 2 boys now. You must miss her." "I do," Thomas admitted. "But that's life, isn't it? People grow up and build their own lives. I just hope my children, if I have them, stay a little closer to home." The casual mention of future children made something flutter in Priscilla's stomach. This was real. In a few hours, she would be married to this man, and the life they would build together would include all the intimacies and responsibilities that marriage entailed. The ride into Bandera felt shorter than the previous day's journey. Thomas kept up a steady stream of conversation, pointing out landmarks, telling her about the neighbors whose properties bordered his, explaining the rhythms of ranch life. Priscilla learned that he usually rose before dawn, that he worked from sunup to sundown except on Sundays when he tried to rest and attend church, that he had been teaching himself to cook since his father died because he refused to live on nothing but beef jerky and beans. Reverend Matthews was a thin man in his 50s with kind eyes and a gentle manner. He received them in the small church on the edge of town, a simple wooden structure with handmade pews and a cross fashioned from mesquite wood. "Thomas, good to see you," the Reverend said, shaking his hand warmly before turning to Priscilla. "And you must be Miss Montgomery. Welcome to Bandera. I hope your journey was not too arduous." "It was long, but I'm glad to be here," Priscilla said. "Well then, shall we proceed? I understand you have witnesses coming." The Hendersons arrived moments later, a pleasant couple in their 40s who ran the town's boarding house. Mrs. Henderson embraced Priscilla as if she were a long-lost daughter. "Oh, my dear, you're even prettier than Thomas described. He's been so nervous about your arrival, checking the stage schedule every day for a week." Thomas looked embarrassed but did not deny it. "I wanted to make sure I didn't miss her." The ceremony itself was brief and simple. Priscilla and Thomas stood before Reverend Matthews in the quiet church while he read from his worn Bible and asked them to speak their vows. When Thomas took her hand in his palm was warm and slightly rough, and his voice was steady as he promised to honor and cherish her. Priscilla spoke her own vows, meaning each word more than she had expected to. This was not the marriage she had imagined as a girl, but it was real and honest, and that seemed more valuable than any grand romance. "You may kiss your bride," Reverend Matthews said with a smile. Thomas leaned down, his eyes meeting hers for a moment as if asking permission. Then his lips brushed against hers, feather light and chaste, a first kiss that felt like a promise rather than a claiming. When he pulled back, his cheeks were slightly flushed, and Priscilla felt her own face warming. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Irving," the Reverend announced. Mrs. Henderson insisted on hosting a small celebration lunch at the boarding house, and Priscilla found herself swept into a whirlwind of introductions. The small dining room filled with curious townspeople who had heard about Thomas's mail-order bride and wanted to meet her. There was Dr. Caldwell, an older gentleman who served as the town's physician, the mercantile owner, Mr. Peterson, and his chatty wife. The school teacher, Miss Annie Parker, a young woman near Priscilla's own age who seemed genuinely pleased to have another educated woman in town. "You must come to the ladies' auxiliary meetings," Miss Parker said, her enthusiasm infectious. "We meet every other Wednesday. It's nothing formal, just a chance to socialize and work on projects together. Last month we made quilts for the orphanage in San Antonio." "I would like that," Priscilla said, and realized she meant it. The people of Bandera were rough around the edges, shaped by the harsh land they inhabited, but there was a genuine warmth beneath the weathered exteriors. Thomas stayed close to her throughout the gathering, not hovering but present, occasionally placing a hand on the small of her back or stepping in when someone's questions became too personal. Priscilla appreciated his quiet support, the way he seemed attuned to her comfort without making a show of it. It was late afternoon by the time they returned to the ranch. The sun was still high, but Thomas explained that the animals needed tending. "I usually spend the evening doing chores. You're welcome to rest after the long day, or I can show you around if you'd prefer." "I would like to help," Priscilla said. "If I'm going to be a rancher's wife, I should learn what that entails." Thomas looked pleased. "All right then, let's start with the chickens. They're the easiest." He was patient as he showed her how to collect eggs, how to scatter feed, how to check the water troughs. The chickens clucked and fussed around her skirts, and Priscilla found herself laughing at their antics. From there, they moved to the barn where Thomas kept his horses. He introduced her to each one, explaining their temperaments and quirks. "This is Copper," he said, stroking the nose of a large chestnut gelding. "He's my main riding horse, smart and steady. And this pretty girl is Belle. She's gentler, good for someone still learning to ride Western style." "I can ride," Priscilla said. "My father taught me when I was young, but it's been a while." "Then we'll get you back in the saddle soon. It's important out here. Distances are far, and you need to be able to get to town or a neighbor's if there's an emergency and I'm not around." As they worked together, feeding the horses and checking on the cattle in the near pasture, Priscilla felt some of her lingering tension ease. This was honest work, satisfying in its simplicity. There was something deeply appealing about the rhythm of it, the way each task built on the previous one, creating a structure for the day. When they finally returned to the house as the sun touched the horizon, both of them were dusty and tired. Thomas pumped water from the well so Priscilla could wash up first, then excused himself to clean up in the barn. When he returned, his hair was damp again, and he had changed into a clean shirt. Dinner was a shared effort. Priscilla had insisted on helping, and together they prepared a simple meal of fried ham, boiled potatoes, and the last of the vegetables from Thomas's small garden. As they worked side by side in the small kitchen area, their movements began to find a rhythm, a careful dance of proximity and purpose. "This is nice," Thomas said quietly as they sat down to eat. "Having someone to share a meal with. I didn't realize how lonely I was until I wasn't anymore." Priscilla met his eyes across the table. "I felt the same way after my father died. The silence in an empty house is its own kind of burden." "It doesn't have to be silent anymore," Thomas said, "for either of us." After dinner, as the last light faded from the sky, they sat together on the porch. The night air was cooler, bringing relief from the day's heat. Crickets sang in the grass, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out to its pack. The stars emerged one by one, more stars than Priscilla had ever seen in her life, the Milky Way stretching across the darkness like a river of light. "I've never seen anything like this," she breathed. "The stars, I mean. In Charleston, there were too many lamps, too many buildings." "It's one of my favorite things about this place," Thomas said. "No matter how hard the day was, the stars are always here at night, reminding you that the world is bigger than your problems." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and then Thomas cleared his throat. "I want you to know that I don't expect anything tonight. I know we barely know each other, even if we are married now. We can take things slow, get to know each other properly first." Priscilla felt a rush of gratitude for his consideration, but also something else, a growing curiosity about this man who continued to surprise her at every turn. "Thank you for saying that, but I also want you to know that I'm not afraid. You've been nothing but kind since I arrived. I trust you." Thomas reached over and took her hand, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "That means more to me than you know. Trust is earned, and I intend to spend every day earning yours." When they finally went inside, Thomas showed Priscilla where he had put her few belongings. He lingered in the doorway, uncertainty flickering across his face. "I can still sleep in the barn if you'd prefer." "No," Priscilla said, surprising herself with her certainty. "We're married. This is your home, your bed. I won't banish you from it." What followed was tentative and gentle, two strangers learning each other in the darkness. Thomas was careful with her, attentive to her responses, and Priscilla found that the physical intimacy of marriage was not the frightening ordeal she had been warned about. Instead, it felt like an extension of the trust they had been building since the moment he handed her those wildflowers, a shared vulnerability that brought them closer together. Afterward, as Priscilla lay with her head on Thomas's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, she felt something shift inside her. This was her life now. This house, this land, this man. And perhaps, with time and care, it could become something more than just an arrangement. Perhaps it could become a home. The days that followed fell into a comfortable pattern. Priscilla rose early with Thomas, learning the routines of ranch life. She took over the cooking, grateful to have ingredients to work with after months of scraping together meals from almost nothing. Thomas had a well-stocked larder and a smokehouse with preserved meat, evidence of his careful planning. She also began to put her own stamp on the house. Thomas had mentioned that there was a trunk in the barn with things that had belonged to his mother. And when Priscilla investigated, she found linens, some dishes, and a beautiful quilt pieced in shades of blue and white. Thomas seemed pleased when she asked if she could use these things, as if he had been waiting for someone who would appreciate his mother's handiwork. "She would have liked you," he said, running his hand over the quilt. "She always said that a strong woman was worth more than gold, that my father never could have built his business without her working beside him." "Tell me about her," Priscilla said, and Thomas shared stories of his childhood, painting a picture of a woman who had been both tender and tough, who had taught him that real strength included kindness. In return, Priscilla told him about her own mother, about growing up without a mother's guidance, about her father's quiet grief that had colored her entire adolescence. They shared their losses and found comfort in mutual understanding, building a foundation of intimacy through shared confidences. 2 weeks after her arrival, Thomas announced at breakfast that he needed to ride out to check on the cattle in the far pasture and repair some fence line. "It'll take most of the day. Will you be all right here alone?" Priscilla assured him she would be fine. She had plenty to keep her busy, including a vegetable garden that needed weeding and some mending that had piled up. But after Thomas rode off on Copper, the ranch felt emptier than she had expected. She found herself listening for his footsteps, missing the sound of his voice. She was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard horses approaching from the front. Curious, Priscilla walked around the side of the house and stopped short. 3 men sat on horseback in front of the porch, and something about their demeanor made her skin prickle with unease. They wore guns low on their hips, and their faces had the hard look of men accustomed to taking what they wanted. "Can I help you?" Priscilla called out, trying to keep her voice steady. The man in the center, older than the others with a scarred face and cold eyes, smiled without warmth. "Well now, looks like Tom Irving finally got himself a wife. Pretty little thing too, Tom around." "My husband is working on the property," Priscilla said, deliberately vague. "Can I give him a message, your husband?" the man repeated, almost mocking. "Ain't that sweet? You tell your husband that Jack Dalton came by. Tell him I'm still interested in buying his land, and my offer stands. $500 for the whole spread." Priscilla had no idea what the land was worth, but she knew enough to recognize an insult when she heard one. "I'll tell him you came by." "You do that, honey." Dalton's eyes crawled over her in a way that made her feel exposed despite being fully dressed. "And you tell him that it'd be a shame if something happened to his pretty new bride out here all alone. This is wild country. Accidents happen all the time." It was not quite a threat, but the implication was clear. Priscilla forced herself to stand straight to meet his gaze without flinching. "I'll give my husband your message. Good day, gentlemen." Dalton laughed, a harsh sound that held no humor. Got some spine to her. Tom always did have good taste. He wheeled his horse around, and the other 2 men followed, kicking up dust as they rode away. Priscilla waited until they were out of sight before allowing herself to tremble. She went back into the house and checked that Thomas's rifle was where he kept it, loaded and ready. Then she forced herself to return to her tasks, refusing to let fear paralyze her. When Thomas returned near sunset, his face lit up as he always did when he first saw her, but the smile faded when he noticed her expression. "What's wrong?" Priscilla told him about the visitors, watching as his jaw tightened with each detail. When she finished, Thomas set down his tools with careful deliberation and took off his hat, running a hand through his hair. "Damn it," he said quietly. "I was hoping Dalton would have given up by now." "Who is he?" Thomas gestured for her to sit with him on the porch. "Jack Dalton runs a big operation about 20 miles from here. He's been buying up smaller ranches for the past 5 years, either through legitimate purchase or by making life so difficult for the owners that they sell cheap just to get away from him. My land sits right in the middle of a tract he wants to control. It has the best water access in the area because of the creek. Why haven't you sold if he's been harassing you?" "Because this land is mine," Thomas said, his voice firm. "I worked hard for it, built this house with my own hands, built this herd from almost nothing. I'm not going to let a bully push me off just because it's inconvenient for his plans. Besides, he's offering a fraction of what it's worth. He's counting on intimidation rather than fair dealing." Priscilla absorbed this, understanding now that her new life came with complications she had not anticipated. "What will you do?" "Same thing I've been doing. Stand my ground. The law in Bandera is on my side. Sheriff Mitchell knows what Dalton's been up to. As long as Dalton doesn't do anything overtly illegal, there's not much anyone can do." He looked at her, concern evident in his green eyes. "But I don't like that he came here when I was gone. I don't like that he threatened you, even indirectly." "I'm not afraid of him," Priscilla said, and was surprised to find it was mostly true. "I've faced worse than a land-grabbing rancher." Thomas reached over and took her hand. "You shouldn't have to face anything like this. You came here for a fresh start, not to be pulled into my problems." "Your problems are my problems now," Priscilla said firmly. "That's what marriage means. We face things together." Something shifted in Thomas's expression, a deepening of the affection that had been growing between them. "How did I get so lucky?" he murmured, and then he kissed her, not with the tentative gentleness of their early days but with genuine passion. That night, as they lay together in the darkness, Thomas held her close. "I'll teach you to shoot," he said. "Not just to handle the rifle, but to really shoot. And I won't leave you alone again until I'm sure Dalton has moved on to harassing someone else." "All right," Priscilla agreed, feeling safer wrapped in his arms than she had any right to feel given the circumstances. The shooting lessons began the next day. Thomas set up targets behind the barn and showed Priscilla how to hold the rifle properly, how to breathe and squeeze the trigger rather than pull it. She had never fired a gun before, and the kick of the rifle surprised her, but Thomas was patient, adjusting her stance and offering encouragement until she managed to hit the target more often than she missed. "You're a natural," he said with obvious pride. "Another week of practice and you'll be better than me." "I doubt that," Priscilla said, but she was pleased with her progress. There was something empowering about learning this skill, about knowing she could protect herself if necessary. Life settled into a new rhythm. The garden began to flourish under Priscilla's care, and she started spending her afternoons putting up preserves for the winter. Thomas taught her to ride Belle, and soon she was comfortable enough to accompany him on some of his rounds of the property. Together they would ride out to check on the cattle, and Thomas would point out the different plants and animals, teaching her to read the land the way he had learned to do. In town, Priscilla attended her First Lady's auxiliary meeting and found herself warmly welcomed. The women of Bandera were hungry for news from the East, and Priscilla entertained them with stories of Charleston while learning the local gossip in return. Miss Annie Parker became a particular friend, often riding out to the ranch on Sunday afternoons to visit and share books. "You seem happy," Annie observed one day as they sat on the porch shelling peas. "Happier than I expected for a mail-order bride." Priscilla considered this. "I am happy. I didn't expect to be, but Thomas is a good man, better than I had any right to hope for." "He's been different since you arrived," Annie said. "Lighter somehow. Before, he was always so serious, so focused on the work. Now when I see him in town, he smiles more. It's good to see." A month after Priscilla's arrival, Thomas came in from the fields one afternoon with an announcement. "There's a dance in town Saturday night, the monthly social at the town hall. I thought maybe we could go if you're interested." Priscilla felt a flutter of excitement. "I'd like that, but I don't have anything appropriate to wear." "Then we'll go see Mrs. Carson at the dress shop tomorrow. I've been saving up, and I think my wife deserves a new dress." The trip to town the next day was an adventure. Mrs. Carson, the widow Thomas had mentioned, was a handsome woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and skilled hands. She took Priscilla's measurements and showed her several fabrics, finally settling on a beautiful blue calico that brought out the color of Priscilla's eyes. "I can have it ready by Friday if you don't mind me rushing a bit," Mrs. Carson said. "It's so nice to see Thomas settling down. He's been a bachelor too long." When they picked up the dress on Friday, Priscilla was thrilled with the result. The bodice fit perfectly, and the skirt had enough fullness to swirl nicely for dancing. Thomas seemed pleased too, his eyes appreciating as she modeled it for him. The dance was held in the town hall, a large room decorated with bunting and lit by dozens of lanterns. It seemed like everyone from Bandera and the surrounding ranches had turned out. A small band played fiddle music, and the floor was already crowded with couples dancing. Thomas led Priscilla onto the floor for a waltz, and she discovered that he was a surprisingly good dancer, leading her confidently through the steps. "Where did you learn to dance?" she asked, breathless. "My mother insisted," he said with a grin. "She said that just because we were Missouri farm folk didn't mean we had to be ignorant of civilized pursuits. She taught both me and my sister." They danced several dances, and Priscilla found herself laughing more than she had in years. Between sets, Thomas introduced her to more neighbors, and she began to feel like she was becoming part of the community rather than just being the new arrival. It was during a break for refreshments that trouble arrived. Jack Dalton entered the hall with his two companions, and the atmosphere immediately tensed. Priscilla saw Sheriff Mitchell, a grizzled man in his 60s, move toward the door with a warning expression. "Evening, Jack," the sheriff said. "Didn't expect to see you here tonight." "It's a public dance, Sheriff. I've got as much right to be here as anyone." Dalton's eyes scanned the room and landed on Thomas and Priscilla. He started walking in their direction. Thomas moved slightly, positioning himself between Dalton and Priscilla. "Evening, Dalton. Irving." "I see you got my message." Dalton's gaze slid to Priscilla. "Evening, madam. You're looking mighty pretty tonight." "What do you want, Dalton?" Thomas asked, his voice level but cold, just being neighborly. "Wanted to see how married life was treating you. Wanted to remind you that my offer still stands. Might even go up to 600 if you decide quick." "The answer is the same as it's always been." "No." Dalton's face hardened. "You're making a mistake, Irving. A man with a wife now, he's got more to lose, more to worry about. Might make him see things different." Thomas took a step forward, and though Dalton was bigger, there was something in Thomas's posture that made the other man step back. "Are you threatening my wife?" "Just stating facts. This is hard country. Dangerous for folks who don't have enough sense to take good advice when it's offered." Sheriff Mitchell appeared at Dalton's elbow. "That's enough, Jack. You've said your piece. How about you and your boys head on home before this turns into something nobody wants?" For a moment, Dalton looked like he might argue, but then he shrugged. "Sure, Sheriff. No harm meant. Just having a friendly conversation with my neighbor." He tipped his hat to Priscilla, mockery in the gesture, and then he and his men left. The tension in the room gradually eased, and the music started up again. but the joy had gone out of the evening for Priscilla. Thomas must have sensed it because he suggested they head home early. On the ride back to the ranch, Thomas was quiet, his hands tight on the reins. Finally, he said, "I'm sorry. I never meant for you to be drawn into this situation." "Stop apologizing," Priscilla said firmly. "I meant what I said before. We're in this together, but I think we need to talk about what we're going to do if Dalton escalates beyond just threats." Thomas nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about that. Sheriff Mitchell can't do much unless Dalton actually breaks the law, but there are other ranchers around here who are also dealing with his pressure. Maybe it's time we stood together, made it clear that we won't be intimidated." "That sounds sensible," Priscilla said. "United front and all that." Over the next few weeks, Thomas made it a point to visit neighboring ranches and talk to other landowners. Several of them, it turned out, had received similar pressure from Dalton. Thomas organized a meeting at his ranch, and 6 men showed up, all owners of smaller spreads that Dalton had targeted. Priscilla served coffee and listened as the men talked. It was decided that they would form a loose association, agreeing to support each other if Dalton tried to move against any one of them. They would also make sure that Sheriff Mitchell was kept informed of any incidents, building a paper trail in case legal action became necessary. "It's not much," Thomas said after everyone had left, "but at least we're not isolated anymore." "It's something," Priscilla agreed, "and sometimes that's enough." Summer deepened into its full heat, and Priscilla adjusted to the rhythms of Texas weather. The work was hard, but she found satisfaction in it. She learned to churn butter, to pluck and dress chickens, to help Thomas with the endless task of maintaining fences and buildings. Her hands, once soft, developed calluses. Her skin, despite her best efforts with bonnets, tanned from hours in the sun. But she was also happier than she had been in years. Thomas was proving to be not just a good husband but a genuine partner. He consulted her on decisions about the ranch, valued her opinions, and shared the work without making her feel less capable. More than that, what had started as mutual respect was deepening into something warmer, something that felt remarkably like love. She realized it one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Thomas was telling her about his day, about a calf that had been born that morning, healthy and strong, and she found herself watching his face more than listening to his words. She loved the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the deep timbre of his voice, the way he absently reached for her hand whenever they sat together. She loved his steadiness, his kindness, his quiet strength. "What are you thinking about?" Thomas asked, catching her staring. "You," Priscilla said honestly. "How glad I am that I answered your advertisement, how different my life could have been." Thomas reached up and brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch gentle. "I think about that too. About how close I came to giving up on the idea of finding a wife, of having a family. If I had waited another month, if you had chosen someone else's advertisement instead of mine, none of this would exist." "But it does exist," Priscilla said. "We exist. This life we're building exists." "I'm falling in love with you," Thomas said quietly. "I don't know if it's too soon to say that, if it makes me sound foolish, but it's true. You're everything I hoped for and so much more than I expected." Priscilla felt tears prick at her eyes. "I love you too. I think I started falling for you the moment you handed me those wildflowers with that nervous smile." Thomas pulled her into his arms, and they kissed as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold, the sky celebrating their declarations with a show of natural beauty. Life was not without its challenges. In late August, a severe thunderstorm swept through, bringing hail that damaged some of the crops and lightning that started a small grass fire. Thomas and Priscilla worked through the night to beat out the flames before they could spread to the barn. The next morning, exhausted and covered in soot, they surveyed the damage together. "Could have been worse," Thomas said philosophically. "The house and barn are fine, the animals are safe. We lost some garden vegetables, but we'll manage. How can you be so calm about this?" Priscilla asked, frustration bubbling up. "We worked so hard on that garden." "Because getting upset won't change anything," Thomas said, pulling her close despite both of them being filthy. "This is ranch life, love. Nature gives and nature takes. You learn to roll with it or you go crazy. We'll plant a fall garden. We'll make do. We always do." His calm steadiness helped ground her, and Priscilla leaned into his embrace, letting his strength bolster her own. They would face this setback like they faced everything else together. September brought a blessed relief from the summer heat, and with it came the fall roundup. Thomas explained that he needed to gather his cattle, cull the ones ready for market, and brand the new calves. Several neighboring ranchers agreed to help each other with their roundups, moving from property to property over the course of a few weeks. When the group arrived at the Irving ranch, Priscilla found herself cooking for a dozen hungry men. It was exhausting work, but she was determined to hold up her end. She made huge pots of stew, baked countless loaves of bread, and kept coffee perpetually brewing. The men were appreciative and respectful, and Priscilla found herself enjoying the camaraderie, the sense of community that came with neighbors helping neighbors. On the second day of the roundup, Priscilla was hanging laundry when she heard shouting from the direction of the cattle. She ran toward the sound and arrived to see one of the young cowboys, barely 20, on the ground clutching his leg. A wild-eyed cow stood nearby, her calf bawling behind her. "Get back!" Thomas shouted, seeing Priscilla. He and another man managed to rope the cow and move her away while a third helped the injured cowboy to safety. Dr. Caldwell, who had been visiting a neighboring ranch, arrived within the hour. He examined the leg and determined it was badly bruised but not broken. The young man, whose name was Billy, would need to rest for a few days. "You can stay here while you recover," Priscilla told him without hesitation. "We have space, and you shouldn't be moved more than necessary." Billy stayed in the small room that Thomas had been using for storage, and Priscilla fussed over him like a mother hen, bringing him meals and making sure he kept his leg elevated as the doctor had ordered. Thomas teased her about her nursing instincts, but she could see he was pleased by her compassion. After Billy had recovered enough to ride home, his father came to collect him. He was a weathered rancher named Samuel Drake who ran a spread south of theirs. "I'm grateful to you both," he said gruffly. "Not everyone would have taken in Billy like that. You've made a friend of the Drake family." It was these small moments, Priscilla realized, that were weaving her into the fabric of this community. She was no longer an outsider, no longer just the mail-order bride. She was Mrs. Irving, a respected member of the community with her own place and purpose. October arrived with cooler temperatures and the stunning transformation of the landscape. The grasses turned golden, and the trees along the creek showed touches of red and yellow. Priscilla's fall garden was producing well, and she spent her days preserving everything she could for the winter ahead. It was during this busy time that she began to suspect she might be pregnant. She had missed her monthly courses, and her breasts felt tender. She was exhausted by evening in a way that felt different from mere physical labor. For a week, she said nothing to Thomas, wanting to be sure before she got his hopes up. Finally, she rode into town alone one morning while Thomas was working on repairing the barn roof. Dr. Caldwell confirmed what she had suspected. She was indeed expecting a child, probably due sometime in late May or early June. Priscilla rode home in a daze, her mind spinning with the implications. She was going to be a mother. She and Thomas were going to have a baby. The child would be born in the spring, would grow up on this ranch, would know this life as their only reality. It was terrifying and wonderful all at once. She waited until after dinner to tell Thomas. They were sitting on the porch as had become their habit, watching the stars emerge. Priscilla took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "There's something you should know," she said quietly. "I saw Dr. Caldwell today." Thomas's face went pale. "Are you sick? Is something wrong?" "No, nothing's wrong. Everything's very right, actually. We're going to have a baby." For a moment, Thomas just stared at her, and then a smile broke across his face like sunshine after rain. He let out a whoop of joy and picked her up, spinning her around before setting her down carefully, suddenly worried. "I shouldn't have done that. Are you all right? Should you be sitting?" "Do you need anything?" Priscilla laughed, delighted by his reaction. "I'm fine. Pregnant women don't break." "But yes, we're having a baby. Dr. Caldwell thinks late May or early June." Thomas pulled her back into his arms, holding her as if she were made of glass. "A baby," he murmured. "We're going to be parents. Priscilla, I can't even begin to tell you what this means to me." "I think I know," she said, hearing the emotion thick in his voice. "Because I feel it too." That night, they lay awake long into the darkness, talking about the future. They discussed names, both masculine and feminine, since they had no way of knowing which they would have. Thomas wanted to make sure the bedroom was freshly painted before the baby arrived. Priscilla wanted to start sewing baby clothes and blankets. They made plans and dreamed dreams, their voices soft with wonder. The pregnancy changed things in subtle ways. Thomas became even more protective, refusing to let Priscilla do any heavy lifting and worrying constantly that she was overworking herself. Priscilla had to constantly reassure him that she was fine, that women had been having babies while running households for thousands of years. The news spread through Bandera quickly, and Priscilla found herself the recipient of much advice, both helpful and ridiculous. The ladies of the auxiliary threw her a surprise party at the church, presenting her with handmade baby clothes and a beautiful cradle that someone's grandfather had crafted from mesquite wood. Annie Parker was particularly excited, declaring herself the baby's honorary aunt. "I always wanted siblings," she confessed. "This is the closest I'll get unless I marry and have my own children, and that seems unlikely given the shortage of suitable men in Bandera." "You never know," Priscilla said. "I certainly didn't expect to find love when I came here. I thought I was entering into a practical arrangement. Instead, I found everything I never knew I wanted." As winter set in, mild by Eastern standards but chilly enough to require fires in the evenings, Priscilla's pregnancy became more evident. Her belly swelled, and she felt the baby move for the first time in mid-December, a flutter like butterfly wings that made her gasp with delight. Thomas spent that entire evening with his hand on her stomach, waiting patiently until he could feel the movements too. Christmas was a quiet celebration, just the two of them with a small tree that Thomas cut from the property. They exchanged simple gifts. Priscilla had sewn Thomas a new shirt, and Thomas had fashioned her a beautiful jewelry box from cedar wood. But the real gift was the life they had built together, the family they were creating. The only shadow on their happiness was the continuing pressure from Jack Dalton. He had made several more offers through intermediaries, each one slightly higher than the last, but still far below the land's actual value. Thomas continued to refuse, and Dalton's frustration was becoming evident. In January, one of the neighbor ranchers who had attended Thomas's meeting found his water poisoned, his cattle sickened. It was impossible to prove who was responsible, but everyone had their suspicions. The incident galvanized the small ranchers, and they began taking turns patrolling each other's properties at night. "I don't like you being here alone while I'm out on patrol," Thomas said one evening as he prepared to ride out. "I'll be fine," Priscilla assured him. "I have the rifle and I'm not afraid to use it. Besides, Belle can kick if she needs to. She's almost as protective of me as you are." Thomas kissed her thoroughly before leaving. "I'll be back before dawn. Keep the doors locked." Priscilla did as he asked, securing the house before settling into the rocking chair with some mending. She was drowsy when she heard horses outside, too many horses to be just Thomas returning. She stood carefully, her hand going to her swollen belly protectively, and moved to the window. In the moonlight, she could see 3 men dismounting. Even in the darkness, she recognized Jack Dalton's profile. Her heart began to race. She grabbed the rifle from its place by the door and made sure it was loaded. "Mrs. Irving," Dalton called out, "I know you're in there, your husband around." Priscilla moved to the door but did not open it. "My husband will be back shortly," she lied. "You should leave." "Now, that's not very neighborly. I just want to talk business with Tom. Maybe with you carrying his child now, he'll see reason. A man's got to think about his family's future." "I said leave," Priscilla repeated, louder this time. "You're trespassing and I'm armed," Dalton laughed. "You hear that, boys? The little lady's armed. That's real cute." Priscilla's hands tightened on the rifle. She moved back from the door and positioned herself where she could see through the window. Dalton was approaching the porch steps. "This is your last warning," she called out. "I will shoot." "No, you won't. You're a lady from Charleston, probably never fired a gun in your life." "Now, why don't you?" Priscilla fired the rifle, deliberately aiming high so the bullet struck the porch post inches from Dalton's head. The sound was deafening in the quiet night, and Dalton stumbled backward, his face shocked. "The next one won't be a warning shot," Priscilla said, working the lever to chamber another round. "Get off my property." For a long moment no one moved, then Dalton's face twisted with rage. "You crazy? I'd listen to the lady if I were you," a new voice called out. Thomas emerged from the side of the house, his own rifle trained on Dalton and his men. Behind him came 3 other men, also armed. "You're outnumbered and outgunned, Dalton, and you're also trespassing and threatening a pregnant woman." Sheriff Mitchell would be real interested in hearing about that. Dalton looked around, calculating his odds, and apparently decided discretion was the better part of valor. "This isn't over, Irving." "Yes, it is," Thomas said flatly. "Because if you ever come near my wife again, if you ever set foot on my land again, I will personally escort you to the sheriff in chains. That's a promise." Dalton and his men mounted their horses and rode off, their departure swift and angry. Only after they were out of sight did Thomas lower his rifle and turn to the house. Priscilla opened the door and he rushed to her, checking her over anxiously. "Are you all right? Is the baby all right?" "We're fine," Priscilla said, though now that the danger had passed, she was shaking. "I shot at him. I actually shot at him." "You did exactly right," Thomas said fiercely, holding her close. "I heard the shot and came running. God, Priscilla, if anything had happened to you, but it didn't," she said. "We're both fine, and maybe now Dalton will finally back off." The other men approached, and Priscilla recognized Samuel Drake and 2 of the other neighboring ranchers. "We were patrolling when we heard the shot," Samuel explained. "Came as fast as we could. Your wife's got real nerve, Tom. Not many women would stand up to Jack Dalton like that." "She's something special," Thomas agreed, pride evident in his voice. The incident seemed to be a turning point. Word spread quickly about what had happened, and suddenly Dalton's intimidation tactics seemed less effective when everyone knew that even a pregnant woman had stood up to him. The sheriff paid Dalton a visit to have a conversation about his behavior, and while nothing official happened, the message was clear. The pressure eased. February passed into March, and the land began to show signs of spring. Priscilla's pregnancy advanced, and Dr. Caldwell made regular visits to check on her. Everything seemed to be progressing normally, though the doctor warned Thomas that childbirth was always unpredictable and to be prepared for any eventuality. Thomas threw himself into preparing for the baby's arrival with the same focused intensity he brought to everything else. He painted the small back room that would serve as a nursery, built a changing table, and even fashioned a mobile with small carved horses that would hang over the cradle. Priscilla sewed tiny gowns and blankets, her hands creating clothes for a baby she had not yet met but already loved beyond measure. Annie visited regularly, helping with the preparations and keeping Priscilla company as her mobility became more limited. "Have you thought about what you'll do if it's a boy?" Annie asked one afternoon as they folded baby clothes. "Love him and raise him to be a good man like his father," Priscilla said simply. "Why? I just mean, will you try for more children? Try for a daughter?" Priscilla smiled. "I'll be grateful for whatever healthy child God sees fit to give us. If we're blessed with more children later, wonderful. If not, we'll cherish the one we have." April arrived with wildflowers carpeting the prairie, the same purple verbena and white daisies that Thomas had given Priscilla on the day she arrived. It seemed fitting somehow, like the land itself was celebrating the coming birth. The baby arrived on a warm evening in late May, just as Dr. Caldwell had predicted. Priscilla's labor began in the late afternoon, and Thomas sent one of the ranch hands racing to town to fetch the doctor while he stayed with her, holding her hand and looking more terrified than she had ever seen him. "Women do this every day," Priscilla reminded him between contractions, trying to ease his worry. "Not my woman," Thomas said fiercely. "Not carrying my child." Dr. Caldwell arrived as the sun was setting, and Mrs. Henderson came with him, an experienced woman who had assisted at dozens of births. They shooed Thomas out of the room despite his protests, and Priscilla heard him pacing in the main room like a caged animal. The labor was long and painful, lasting through the night and into the early morning hours. Priscilla had never experienced anything like it, the waves of pain that seemed endless. But Mrs. Henderson was a calming presence, coaching her through each contraction, and Dr. Caldwell was skilled and confident. Finally, as the sun rose on a new day, Priscilla heard the most beautiful sound she had ever experienced, a baby's lusty cry. Dr. Caldwell laid the baby on her chest, and she looked down at the tiny face, the perfect little fingers and toes. "It's a boy," the doctor announced with a smile. "A healthy, strong boy." Thomas burst through the door, having apparently given up on waiting for permission to enter. His eyes were red-rimmed from exhaustion and worry, but they lit up when he saw Priscilla holding their son. "We have a boy," Priscilla said, her voice hoarse but filled with wonder. "Thomas, we have a son." Thomas approached the bed carefully, as if afraid he might disturb some sacred moment. When he looked down at his son, tears spilled freely down his cheeks. "He's perfect." "Priscilla, he's absolutely perfect." They decided to name him Daniel Irving after Thomas's father, with the middle name of James after Priscilla's. Little Daniel was indeed perfect, with a shock of dark hair and green eyes that would, they were told, likely change color in the coming months. He was healthy and strong, nursing well and sleeping in satisfying stretches. Thomas was besotted, spending hours just watching the baby sleep, marveling at every tiny movement. He was a natural father, changing diapers without complaint and walking the floor with Daniel when he fussed. Priscilla watched her husband with their son and fell in love with him all over again. The community rallied around the new family. Neighbors brought meals and gifts. Annie visited almost daily, declaring herself Daniel's favorite aunt and practicing holding him with careful determination. Even gruff Samuel Drake stopped by with a hand-carved rattle, his weathered face softening when he saw the baby. As spring gave way to summer, life settled into a new rhythm. Priscilla learned to balance caring for Daniel with her other responsibilities, though Thomas insisted on hiring a young girl from town to come help a few days a week so Priscilla could rest. Maria was 16, the daughter of a Mexican family that had lived in the area for generations, and she was wonderful with babies. "You're being overprotective," Priscilla told Thomas one evening as they sat on the porch, Daniel sleeping peacefully in his father's arms. "I almost lost you during the birth," Thomas said quietly. "Dr. Caldwell said you lost a lot of blood, that for a while he wasn't sure how things would go. So yes, I'm being overprotective and I make no apologies for it." Priscilla had not known how close things had been, and the revelation sobered her. "I'm fine now, strong and healthy, and Daniel needs a mother who is fully present, not exhausted all the time." "Which is why Maria comes to help," Thomas said reasonably. "Let me take care of you, Priscilla. Let me make sure you have what you need." She could not argue with that, so she simply leaned against his shoulder and watched their son sleep, feeling more content than she had ever imagined possible. The summer passed peacefully. The ranch thrived under Thomas's careful management, and with the help of his neighboring alliance, there were no more incidents with Dalton. In fact, they heard through the town gossip that Dalton had sold his operation and moved to New Mexico, apparently deciding that the resistance he faced in Bandera was more trouble than it was worth. "Good riddance," Thomas said when he heard the news. "Maybe now we can all just focus on building our lives without looking over our shoulders." Daniel grew rapidly, becoming more alert and interactive. His eyes settled into the same green as his father's, and his personality began to emerge curious, generally happy, but with a stubborn streak that Priscilla suspected he inherited from both parents. By fall, Priscilla felt ready to return to more of her regular activities. She began attending the ladies' auxiliary meetings again, bringing Daniel along in a basket. The women cooed over him and took turns holding him while Priscilla caught up on the local news. It was at one of these meetings that Annie made an announcement. She was engaged to a new rancher who had recently bought property north of town, a widower with 2 young children who needed a mother and a teacher for his growing family. "I know it's sudden," Annie said, blushing, "but Edward is a good man and his children are wonderful. It feels right." Priscilla embraced her friend, genuinely happy for her. "You deserve all the happiness in the world. When's the wedding?" "Next month. And I want you to stand up with me if you will." "I'd be honored," Priscilla said. Annie's wedding was a joyous affair, held at the church with the whole town in attendance. Priscilla stood beside her friend, holding Daniel while Annie exchanged vows with her Edward, and she thought about her own wedding day less than 2 years earlier. She had stood in this same church, marrying a stranger, hoping for the best but prepared for much worse. Instead, she had found love and partnership and a life richer than any she could have imagined. She looked over at Thomas, who was watching her with that special smile that was reserved just for her, and she knew that answering his advertisement had been the best decision she had ever made. Daniel's first birthday arrived in May, and they held a celebration at the ranch. It seemed like half the county showed up, bringing food and gifts and good wishes. Daniel was overwhelmed by all the attention but delighted with his first taste of cake, getting more on his face than in his mouth while everyone laughed. "Can you believe it's been almost 2 years since you arrived?" Thomas asked that evening after all the guests had left. They sat on the porch in their usual spot, Daniel sleeping between them in his basket. "Sometimes it feels like a lifetime ago," Priscilla said. "Other times it feels like yesterday. I remember being so scared stepping off that stage, convinced I was making a terrible mistake. And now I know I was exactly where I was supposed to be. That train ticket, that advertisement, all those letters, they led me to you, to this life, to our son. How could I regret any of it?" Thomas reached over and took her hand, threading their fingers together. "I never believed in fate before. Always thought a man made his own luck through hard work and good decisions. But meeting you, falling in love with you, that feels like something more than coincidence." "Maybe it was both," Priscilla suggested. "You made good decisions in how you presented yourself in that advertisement. You worked hard to build something worth sharing with a partner. But maybe there was also a little bit of fate involved in making sure I saw your particular advertisement among all the others." "I like that," Thomas said. "The idea that we both did our part and the universe helped us along." That summer, Priscilla discovered she was pregnant again. The news filled them both with joy and some trepidation, remembering the difficulties of Daniel's birth. But Dr. Caldwell assured them that second births were often easier, and Priscilla seemed stronger and healthier this time. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through fall and winter. Daniel was toddling now, getting into everything and keeping Priscilla constantly busy. Thomas joked that they were going to need to build an addition to the house if they kept having children, but Priscilla could see that he was already planning exactly that. The second baby, a daughter they named Rebecca Ann after Thomas's mother and Priscilla's friend Annie, arrived on a cold February morning. The birth was indeed easier than Daniel's, and Rebecca came into the world with a head full of dark hair and lungs that could wake the entire ranch. "She's going to be trouble, this one," Dr. Caldwell said with amusement. "Strong-willed from the start." Daniel was fascinated by his little sister, wanting to touch her constantly and bring her his toys. Watching her children together, Priscilla felt her heart might burst from the fullness of her love. Life with two young children was chaotic but joyful. Maria came more frequently to help, and Annie visited when she could, bringing her stepchildren to play with Daniel. The Irving ranch became known as a welcoming place, always open to neighbors, always ready to help those in need. Thomas thrived as a father, patient with the children's endless questions and demands. He taught Daniel to ride on a gentle old mare, holding him secure in the saddle and walking beside him around the corral. He sang to Rebecca in a surprisingly pleasant voice, lullabies his own mother had sung to him. "This is what I wanted," he told Priscilla one evening after they had finally gotten both children to sleep. "Not just the ranch or the success, but this, a family, a home filled with love and laughter. You gave me that. We gave it to each other," Priscilla corrected. "I was just as lost before I found you." The years passed in a blur of milestones and small moments. Daniel started school with Annie as his teacher. Rebecca revealed herself to be as stubborn as predicted but also fiercely intelligent. The ranch continued to prosper, and Thomas was able to add that extension to the house, giving the children their own rooms. Priscilla's role in the community expanded as well. She became known for her kindness and practical wisdom, someone neighbors turned to for advice or help. She organized charitable efforts through the church, making sure that families facing hard times had food and support. She taught reading lessons to adults who had never learned, holding classes in her home on Sunday afternoons. More children came: a son named Matthew, then twin girls named Sarah and Catherine. The house rang with noise and activity, and while there were exhausting moments, Priscilla had never been happier. She would sometimes catch sight of Thomas playing with the children in the yard and marvel at how far they had come from that first uncertain meeting at the stage. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Thomas surprised her with a trip back to Charleston. It was the first time Priscilla had been back since leaving, and she was struck by how much the city had changed and how much she had changed. The woman who had left Charleston had been frightened and desperate, willing to do anything to escape poverty and uncertainty. The woman who returned was confident and loved, a successful rancher's wife, a mother, a pillar of her community. She visited her father's grave with Thomas at her side and felt at peace, knowing that he would have been proud of the life she had built. "Are you glad you came back?" Thomas asked as they stood in the cemetery. "I'm glad to have seen it again," Priscilla said honestly. "But I'm even more glad knowing that I get to leave and go home to Texas, to our ranch, to our children. That's where I belong now." They returned to Bandera to a rapturous welcome from their children, who had stayed with Annie and her family. Daniel, now 12, had a growth spurt and was nearly as tall as Priscilla. Rebecca at 10 was all elbows and opinions, already declaring that she wanted to be a teacher like Miss Annie. The younger children had made drawings to welcome them home, carefully preserved despite being handled by enthusiastic young hands. As the years continued to roll by, Priscilla watched her children grow into their own people. Daniel developed his father's steady reliability and his mother's compassionate heart. He worked the ranch alongside Thomas, learning everything his father had to teach. Rebecca indeed became a teacher, taking over when Annie retired. The younger children found their own paths. Matthew became a skilled horse trainer, while the twins showed promise in completely different directions. Sarah in medicine and Catherine in music. Through it all, Priscilla and Thomas's love deepened and matured. They had weathered droughts and floods, illnesses and injuries, the normal trials of raising a large family. They had disagreed and argued, made up and grown stronger. They had learned that love was not just a feeling but a choice, made daily through actions large and small. On their 25th anniversary, the entire extended family gathered at the ranch. Annie and her husband Edward were there with their now adult children. Neighbors who had become dear friends filled the yard. Even Samuel Drake, now in his 70s but still spry, attended with his grandson. Thomas stood on the porch and raised his glass. 25 years ago today, I stood in a church in Bandera and married a woman I had never met. I handed her some wilted wildflowers and hoped she wouldn't think I was a complete fool. I never could have imagined then how that one day would change everything. He found Priscilla in the crowd and held her gaze. "You took a leap of faith when you answered my advertisement. You trusted me when you had no reason to, and you've given me a life beyond my wildest dreams. I love you more today than I did that day in the church, and I'll love you more tomorrow than I do today." Priscilla felt tears streaming down her face, but they were happy tears. She raised her own glass. "I stepped off a stage expecting cruelty and found kindness instead. I came here looking for security and found love. You've been my partner, my best friend, and the finest man I've ever known. These 25 years have been the greatest gift of my life." The party lasted well into the night, full of music and laughter and the kind of joy that comes from people who genuinely love each other, celebrating together. As the stars emerged, bright as ever in the Texas sky, Priscilla and Thomas slipped away from the crowd to their favorite spot on the porch. "Do you ever regret it?" Thomas asked. "Leaving Charleston, coming all the way out here to marry a stranger?" Priscilla laughed. "After 25 years and 5 children, you're still asking me that question. I just like to hear your answer." She took his hand, the gesture as familiar now as breathing. "The only thing I regret is that I didn't find you sooner. Every day with you has been a gift, Thomas Irving. Every single one." They sat together in companionable silence, watching their children and grandchildren. Daniel had married and had two little ones of his own playing in the yard. The ranch spread out around them, familiar and beloved, a testament to years of hard work and dedication. "What are you thinking about?" Thomas asked. "About a scared young woman stepping off a stage, clutching a carpetbag and expecting the worst," Priscilla said. "About a kind man greeting her with flowers and a smile. About how one moment of courage can change everything." "Best decision I ever made," Thomas murmured. "Placing that advertisement. Best decision I ever made," Priscilla countered. "Answering it." As the years continued their inevitable march forward, the Irving Ranch remained a constant in the changing landscape of Texas. The state was modernizing, railroads cutting across the prairie, new towns springing up. But some things remained timeless: the value of hard work, the importance of family, the power of love. Priscilla and Thomas grew old together gracefully. Their hair turned gray, their steps slowed, but their love never diminished. They became the patriarch and matriarch of a sprawling family, offering wisdom and support to children, grandchildren, and eventually great-grandchildren. On their 50th anniversary, too old now to host large parties, they celebrated quietly with just their immediate family. Daniel ran the ranch now, though Thomas still insisted on helping when his health allowed. Rebecca taught at the school in Bandera, beloved by generations of students. The younger children had built successful lives of their own, always staying connected to the family home. That evening, after everyone had left, Priscilla and Thomas returned to their porch one last time. The same stars shone overhead, eternal and constant. The same wildflowers bloomed in the spring. The same creek ran through the property, nourishing the land. "It's been a good life," Thomas said, his voice weathered with age but still warm with love. "The best life I could have imagined." "The best life," Priscilla agreed, leaning against his shoulder as she had done countless times before. "All because of some flowers and a smile." "All because of courage and faith," Thomas corrected. "Yours in coming, mine in hoping someone like you existed." They sat together as the sun set one more time, painting the Texas sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. Two people who had started as strangers, brought together by necessity and circumstance, had built something precious and lasting. Their love had created a family, a legacy, a home. As darkness fell and the stars emerged, bright enough to seem almost close enough to touch, Priscilla thought about that frightened young woman on the stage so many years ago. If she could go back and tell that woman what awaited her, the love, the joy, the full and beautiful life, would she have believed it? Probably not. Some things had to be lived to be understood. Some gifts had to be experienced to be appreciated. And some loves were so profound, so all-encompassing that no words could adequately describe them. "What are you thinking about now?" Thomas asked, the question he had asked her thousands of times over 50 years. "You," Priscilla said simply. "Always you." Thomas squeezed her hand gently, and they sat together under the stars. Two hearts that had found each other against all odds. Two souls that had chosen to walk through life side by side. Two lives that had become one beautiful, shared story. The wildflowers Thomas had given Priscilla that first day had long since wilted and been pressed between the pages of a book, preserved as a reminder of beginnings. But new wildflowers grew every spring, carpeting the prairie in purple and white and yellow, a perpetual reminder that from the smallest gesture of kindness could grow the most magnificent love story. And in a small ranch in Bandera, Texas, in a house built by loving hands and filled with the echoes of laughter and joy, that love story lived on, written in the hearts of everyone who called that place home.